Hello, I'm Toby Fox from 1.5 Million New Homes, the local government challenge sponsored by Redloft and by Vistry. Now, across this series, we've been asking the question, what works, but also what has to change to get more homes built? In this series, Building the Olympic Park, we're asking a different question. How did one of the country's most ambitious examples get started and continue when so many other projects stall or fail? And we've been listening to the people who were there who made it happen. Neale Coleman, May, Eleanor Fawcett, Guy Nicholson, Paul Brickell, and the man who literally wrote the book, Dave Hill. In this episode, we're asking what the rest of the UK can learn from the Olympic Park.
Because of my role, like clienting and commissioning, sort of trying to create good foundations for the Olympic Park and obviously now Old Oak, and knowing how bloody hard it is to actually translate that into reality, I think, we know that we've got our work cut out.
I'm not one of those people who believes that everything that was here before was a load of rubbish. Mm-hmm. There were sporting facilities and other amenities that people genuinely enjoyed. Mm-hmm. There were businesses on parts of the Olympic Park site which were not glamorous businesses at all, but they were important businesses. Mm-hmm. Every big city needs a sort of space at the edge where stuff gets dumped. Yep. You don't want it dumped there forever, but
scrap yards and the like. Yeah.
So every city needs places like that, and also something about the sort of wilderness nature of some of the territory that the park now inhabits was sort of magical, if you like that kind of thing. Yeah. So I think that we should bear in mind that there were sort of nice things about the Lower Lee Valley, even though it was a bit dilapidated and not everybody's cup of tea. What have we lost and what have we gained, and how do you compare those two things? I do think that it's ended up in credit, but it's also reasonable to say that if you'd had a completely blank sheet and you hadn't had to stage an enormous sporting event, en route to where we are now, well, you perhaps wouldn't have done things the way that they have turned out.
But would they have turned out as well?
It's very difficult to say whether a completely different and equally comprehensive approach to regenerating the Lower Lee Valley would have produced a better outcome than the one we have.
Is it dense enough? On reflection, would you have built higher, built more?
Yeah, interesting, because actually that was a real point of contention actually during the development of the master plan, because the first master plan for the legacy was actually denser, and so that would have been, I guess, 2008, 2009, and the densities were higher, the buildings were higher, and there was a point at which I think it was in about 2009, 2010, when particularly Newham and other stakeholders felt very uncomfortable with the density. And I think that this was partly because at that time, a lot of the towers were starting to be built along Stratford High Street that you can see today, which was quite a sort of tricky situation, because, a lot of them just got permission in the kind of post-win frenzy, and it maybe wasn't really quite kind of thought about in a very coherent way. And I think people could see that they were quite problematic. And so there was quite a backlash against density. And so when Andy Altman started as the CEO of the LLDC, came over from Washington, DC, he actually brought on a whole process with, to revisit the densities and to take a much more measured approach that included, townhouses and some of the mid-density that you see today. And I think it was partly because we felt it was really important that families wanted to live on the park. And again, going back to that legacy for East London, we wanted this to be a real bit of city, not what we were seeing on Stratford High Street, which is that people would maybe rent a flat for a year or so and then move as soon as they could. Like, we knew that wasn't really what was going to make this a success, and it wasn't what we promised Londoners. And so Chobham Manor is essentially the kind of remnant of that lower density master plan. And we deliberately decided to make that the first phase to prove to the market that you could deliver market family housing and that it would sell, because at that time we were being told by developers, there's no market for it, there's no point us even building it. So, but then what happened was, of course, then with East Bank coming along, the housing that had been there had to be reaccommodated in the rest of the park. So all of the densities on the rest of the area then went back up again, which, I think actually probably is, we almost went full circle and came back to where we were. But I do think that walking around Chobham Manor today, it's a very special place. And it's a very successful place commercially. And I think it does say something about how we build cities and how we build neighbourhoods that are sort of genuinely for everybody and sort of genuinely mixed, which is relatively rare to see in some of like London's more recent developments. So I think it shows that you can have a development like that with a whole variety of typologies, and that's actually a strength rather than it just all being consistently high density everywhere. But I think it's a bit of a quirk of history that it did kind of get retained, and if it had been a few months later, probably the densities would have gone up on Chobham as well. So yeah, it's a sort of I think it's good that it survived.
But it's not all been without, controversy. Yeah. So for example, the London Stadium is divisive. Some people think it's a terrible thing to have happened and a sort of a rip-off. But other people would say that it's a real asset for London. So talk me through how you view the London Stadium.
Well, I think it's difficult. It was always going to be difficult because the stadium for the games was not set up as a permanent building. Its roof, it had a cable net roof, that was never going to last, so, and when you start to put a great big roof on a stadium like that, you run into all sorts of difficulty with the foundations that have been put in. The technical side of it becomes very difficult. So that was a struggle. But I think, the point is, what would people have wanted there? There was a proposal to take down everything above the ground and effectively have what some people call the Dust Bowl, a 25,000 stadium. That would never have flown. It would probably have ended up costing as much. And we had difficulty, because, let's be clear, there weren't many takers. In fact, in the end, there was one. And when you have only one person to negotiate with, you're not in the greatest of place. So I don't know. I mean, I think the thing is, it's still a big draw. It hosts great concerts. It hosts great events. We've had baseball in there. You look at some of the economic benefits that come into London from that. I mean, again, after the games and the success and the memories of Farah winning the 5 and the 10, would people really have wanted to have seen it knocked down? And once you made the decision you weren't going to knock it down, you were always going to have costs to bear.
Well, I think one thing that I think is a real lesson from the kind of Olympic legacy story that we haven't sort of talked about quite so much, but I do think is really relevant, is the approach to the Olympic fringe, as we called it. And I talked a bit at the beginning about the benefits of the project being outward facing and not seeing itself as a sort of isolated island. And a lot of my work was leading the master planning and delivering the projects on the Olympic Fringe. There were sort of 5 Olympic Fringe master plans, and then over 100 million of investment pre-games in public realm and community projects, and which has continued since. And I think the fact that it feels, as you were just saying, like a diverse place, a rich place, a place that's rooted in the Lower Lee Valley and in its communities, which people love about it. You know, that's kind of what makes it such a lovely place to visit, I think, is a lot because you can wander over to Hackney Wick, and that's like this kind of incredible place. You can walk up to Hackney Marshes, you can walk down to the River Thames, you know, you can go up to Leighton and the fantastic, you know, really traditional high street there. And it's actually that constellation which makes it such a successful sort of piece of city rather than just development project. And so for me, the fact that the LLDC's boundary was deliberately drawn to include some of those places, and the fact that, you know, as I said, the promise for the legacy for East London, not just, you know, delivering as many homes as we could as quickly as possible, is what led to that philosophy and that culture and that mindset. And so I do think that there is a really useful lesson there for other new developments, which are often criticised in this country for being quite soulless in the early phases, especially a little bit desolate. But to think of your community as people within a 15-minute walk of your boundary and not, you know, just the hard red line boundary of land ownership, I think is sort of really crucial to improve the placemaking and the quality and also the desirability, you know, of these new developments. So yeah, I think that's definitely one thing that I would sort of want people to understand about the approach to the Olympic legacy. It was a very inclusive project.
Thinking about what all your tools are in your toolbox and making sure that you sort of get the most out of all of those, whether they're all set up as planning authorities or ever, not sure. I know there's a sort of a mixed model in that. But if you are a planning authority and landowner, you know, that gives you sort of significant powers. Always have that sort of long-term vision, investing in long-term relationships, being honest with partners and, most importantly, local residents about what's possible now as opposed to what might be possible to sort of 5 years on. I've always sort of felt that it's really important to strike the right balance between ambition and realism, because once you sort of overpromise and underdeliver, you don't get that trust back. Respect and trust the people that you're here to serve, really important, and have socioeconomic or inclusive growth, or however you describe it, embedded as at the heart of your organisation from the beginning. Don't see it as something that you don't have to do or you can sort of retrofit later. Don't have it as a sort of a separate bit of the organisation that you go and talk to when you're writing a paper and you say, well, how do I put in a bit about local benefit? See it as a sort of an in-school part of how you do business, and have sort of local partners as part of your governance, invest in young people as part of that process. That was hard. Sometimes I think I've come up with a really good plan and they're like, this doesn't work for us. And that's been one of the most interesting parts of my journey. When I grew up in East London wasn't a great place to say you were from. It had people had a particular view about it, either as a place to work, to live, or whatever it might be. Young people now don't have that. So they can come to buildings like this every day of their life, as opposed to a school trip to West London, as I might have done once a year. I'm talking a very long time ago. And this level of quality on their doorstep is what they can grow up expecting to have. So that narrative for me of like, oh God, you know, I'm feeling a bit of imposter syndrome or whatever it might be, they don't have that hanging off their shoulder. For sure, they have different challenges. But, you know, that sort of... So there is something about being real about the story, understanding that stories evolve and people have different sort of views of the past and the future, and having a sort of an open dialogue that is, that is free enough to bring all of those sort of views in is really important, and to just keep checking in that you haven't lost sight of why you're here.
That's a lesson about change, isn't it? Because you're changing a place, but then you have to accept that it's changed.
Yeah.
And it's quite difficult.
It is.
And that's what all local people have to accept, including the people who are working here.
It is. And, if I go back to when I started in Newham's Access to Jobs team all that time ago, local jobs for local people, as I say, was the thing, it was that CSR agenda. It was about a deprived place with people who needed help. You talk to any one of the East Bank partners now, UCL, Sadler's Wells, BBC, even just listening, London College of Fashion, V&A, all of those.
Give you a shiver down the back.
It does. It does. But they are not coming. I describe it as the park in East London offers opportunities that are life-changing for individuals and game-changing for institutions that choose to take part. They're coming here, transforming their businesses, transforming audiences, student bases, staff, in one of the richest, most, diverse talents seeping through, rich heritage, industrial past, all of that. It's reciprocal, and it feels really good to be in that sort of place. So, always start from this place of what's in it for all of us. Never start as the sort of target police, and we're going to put a target on you and then we're going to see how you do. It's a joint endeavour, and always build in a little bit of flexibility for that sort of serendipitous moment.
Well, I think, yes, there are a number of features of the Olympics which are unique, but which can be replicated to an extent. I mean, one of the great things about the delivery of the Games was we had an unbreakable deadline. Now, in most cases, you don't have that, although I did some work on the Birmingham Commonwealth Games, which was quite similar. And again, it was achieved, some quite tricky stuff there, but the deadline drives. So although you can't have the same sort of deadline as a great sporting event, you can be strict about deadlines and what you're going to achieve and drive things like that. If you'd had an unlimited budget for the Games, then you might have done the stadium differently, but you couldn't. We had to do it at a reasonable cost. Everyone was saying we were going to massively overspend, but we didn't. And in fact, when you look at the money that was spent on the park, the vast majority of that money, or not vast, the great majority of that money wasn't spent on the venues. It was spent on new bridges, on remediation, on infrastructure, on all the things that were needed and that had a permanent long-term legacy. And you've got to work strictly within that. And I mean, that's the reason why, in the end, the ODA actually came in within its budget. Not its first budget, but its first budget was never a serious budget, but the budget that was set by Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor, the ODA came in under that budget in delivering the Games and achieved the platform that made the legacy possible.
So that's it from this episode of Building the Olympic Park, and that's it for the series, but we're going to be back with more series on how projects get built and of course visiting councils again to ask what works and what needs to change to get more homes built very soon. So click like and subscribe and you won't miss those, and we'll look forward to seeing you.